Hello, good morning. Welcome to the second session for today's second day of our conference. My name is Adele Barbato. I am a board member here for CIDOC, and I also work at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. I'm happy to be moderating the session, starting us off with Dominic Oldman. We have a great group of panelists here talking about everything from knowledge bases to modeling to digitization efforts and metrics. So thank you and welcome.
Hi, I'm Dominic Oldman. I'm a director of a social enterprise company called Kartography, but I was formerly at the British Museum for 28 years, working in the information systems department and then as a curator in the Egyptian department. So I was interested in the keynotes this morning. Particularly what I took from it was the issue about omission. You know, what's hidden? What do we exclude? You know, how much does technology actually conspire to exclude things from what we do? And I was very interested in the theme of the conference, which was everything is connected. So this is a term that's used quite often in the world of the web. But where does it come from and what does it actually mean? As a very, very definite history, a very definite system of knowledge, or a system of how we generate knowledge. And it's not originally a Western theme. It's been associated in the West with stuff like ecology and the environment. It's one of the four laws of ecology that was stated in 1971 when computers were really in their infancy. And it said that everything is connected to everything else. There is one ecosphere for all living organisms. And what affects one affects all, this total connection and interconnection of systems. However, the earliest form of the phrase is from China in the 4th century BCE and the philosophy of Taoism, a holistic philosophy in which the world is made up of interconnected and interdependent systems, the concepts of yin and yang, the interconnection of opposites which both define and depend on each other, the interaction between systems that transform and support a constantly changing world. This is a worldview that's also captured in religions like Buddhism, in which you have a direct connection between people and their environments, and the Chinese term ars contextualis, in which a thing is defined by its relations and context in which it existed or exists. Ultimately, Taoism is an early form of systems theory, or cybernetics, which is processual and organismic. The Western tradition is completely different. In the West, we have been concerned with trying to definitively label something as a kind of thing and isolate it from its essential features. Without considering its relations and wider context, we've taken delight in attempting to catalogue the world with so-called scientific objectivity, looking at things at arm's length. When we use the term everything is connected, it's usually in a completely different, narrower, and often technological way compared to its original meaning. Much of Western thinking originated from ancient Greece, and although there were some aspects of processualism or organism, for example, Heraclitus, who pointed out the impermanence of the world, you can't step into the same river twice, and to some extent Aristotle, who, although not a processualist, saw that substance were not completely inert and had purpose. Much of modern Western science developed under the premise that the world is made up of substances, was object-focused, and that everything could be explained mechanically. Descartes modeled the world and the human body as a mechanism that could be taken apart and reduced to its smallest elements to understand how it worked. The whole was simply the sum of its parts. This mechanical approach allowed scientists to develop axioms or laws of science that helped to develop new technology. But as we came into the modern era, it was clear that the world was more complex, and these laws came under critical scrutiny, both in the arts and the natural sciences. We started to see the world not in terms of discrete objects, but as systems, bringing disciplines closer together. And systems theories are about the interconnection and the interaction of systems, not simple linkages. So the premise of this presentation is that the underlying argument is that we've built up a legacy of data documentation in the Cartesian tradition, using mechanical instrumentation. Collections are digitally reduced to intrinsic records absent of their contextual, ethical, social relations, belonging to a Western tradition which is also inherent in relational databases. The umbrella philosophy for the mechanical world of science is the philosophy of external relations, the position that has been and still is instilled in our society, education, and research, that there are things or substances and there are relationships, but they are logically independent of each other. In other words, things have relationships, but they are not internal to them. They stand alone and can be described separately from their relations. This is often called essential documentation. Regardless of how many HTTP links we might add to them, they remain distinct records. During the 20th century, some of the greatest thinkers started as a matter of necessity to understand the complexity in nature and in society, in terms of systems and organisms. This different view affected all disciplines and the nature of transdisciplinary scholarship. This new thinking was described under the philosophy of internal relations. This stated that things were not things at all, they were both processes and relations, becoming, evolving, and ending as a result of their interactions. The processual movement and the growth of systems theories has had a significant effect on the subjects of cultural heritage, like art and inquiry, represented by artists like Hans Hacker, who revealed the commercial and institutional systems behind art, and Jack Burnham, who drew directly from general systems theory and cybernetics. It was also represented in the new art history, processual archaeology, and systems-based anthropology, and so on. However, despite these changes in associated disciplines, we haven't yet managed to reform museum digital data documentation to reflect these changes, despite placing our data in the public domain. It was clear at CIDOC 2023 in Mexico that this does not represent the way in which documentation across the world is perceived. And there remains a distinct difference between Western and non-Western vantage points. Documentation systems and digital standards have resisted the processual, the dynamic, and the transdisciplinary, and as such ignored context in terms of ecological, societal, economic, historical systems in which collection items were created and existed, but which are crucially important to people around the world. It lacks the appropriate diversity of relationships and the ability to respond to new needs. The prevailing view of documentation remains keeping to a traditional template that's database friendly. In other words, the physical properties of the object, the basic provenance, where the object came from, who made the object's composition, the object's condition, and so on. This is not what an essential museum record is or should be today, and therefore the definition of documentation must be updated, and the technology that we use to cater for more complex, dynamic, and diverse data needs to be addressed. Systems of knowledge have been changing from the static, mechanistic legacy of the Cartesian world to a world of systems, but this transition has not been across the board. One key area where a contradiction exists is in digital technology. Computers have become faster, they store vast amounts of information, but the concepts of everything is connected, as I've laid out, are more superficial and concrete. And digital networks hide fragmentation behind a weaker technical linkage, rather than representing living relations. One significant part of this Cartesian legacy in digital is the database management system. The database organizes information in tables and rows. It was originally conceived in industry within a data processing department to deal with the increasing pressure of company bureaucracy like supply chains. Its inventor was Charles Backman. He presented the benefits of databases as their consistent mechanical qualities that were just right for processing commercial data. He compared the database to millions of pigeonholes with the ability to find the right pigeonhole quickly and efficiently. The relational database is a misleading term because it does not refer to semantic relationships, but rather to Cartesian joins. It relies on keywords and indexes and fixed structures. It was not designed with the concept of internal relations in mind, or indeed with the type of complex contextual information that surrounds the life of cultural items. However, the instrumentation of industry and commerce was repurposed for the museum, but the museum shouldn't be represented by a database. Despite the development of relational databases in terms of utilities, export formats like XML, security and capacity, the native architecture of database is not optimized for, or designed for dealing with complex patterns of information, providing semantic logic, dealing with fussiness, or for providing flexibility and expanding the categories of knowledge dynamically. Its strength was its commercial consistency and stability, which means that it protects static models. We all know this because of our experience of databases where we overload them, remove validation, relax data management principles, or simply add more text fields. The problem is regularly and empirically demonstrated. This is a post on social media from Sian Woodward, now Collections Documentation Manager at St Paul's Cathedral, and she highlights the problem. She says, as collection manager, I aim to try and preserve all this created knowledge. But storing the outputs and metadata of this work does not necessarily capture the knowledge. The experience of spending time with the collection, its associated documentation, and the people who have interacted with it, with the collection, has created knowledge that cannot easily be passed on. Sharing metadata will help, but it will take any new owners of collections time to make meaning from the information that's shared. However, spending time researching, enriching, and augmenting collections data is not valued or resourced well in the sector. Publishing database data to the web, regardless of the format, whether it be an API or linked data, only reflects the nature of the originating system. However, it requires additional layers of technology to generate the conversion of data, but is effectively publishing data which does not contain the actual knowledge of the organization, which, unlike central database systems, which focus more on inventory, is constantly evolving. External experts, whether they are in the sector, work in different associated disciplines, or have indigenous knowledge, have even less influence over the model than the originating organizations, curators, conservators, educators, and researchers. This is why new research goes into other systems which operate outside core organizational budgets, funded by temporary grants, which are often shelved and never operated as a going concern once the project and the funding is finished. While larger organizations can provide more sophisticated publication pipelines, they are still fixed by the source system. Moreover, they're out of reach of smaller organizations who equally have more to say about their collections than their collection systems allow. In fact, these pipelines built on top of database systems ensure their static lock-in, working on the premise that the structure of the source database system will be constant and consistent. The middleware, which takes the data and publishes it, perhaps in linked data forms, builds a layer that maps data but ensures stasis, creating additional dependencies, working against change and transformation. The premise of all this technology is that the current form of digital documentation and the standards used in it are correct and will not change significantly. And publishing in a linked data format is somehow seen as corrective when it actually doesn't address the issues of actual content. It would be far more efficient and effective for underlying systems to be naturally and natively interoperable, and databases are not. As a result, we constantly publish legacy data to the web, while the real knowledge goes through more traditional routes, but seen by less people, through books and articles and exhibitions. We ask people to reuse this data, even though we know it has numerous issues, and we don't reuse it ourselves. So how do we change our human and digital systems to respond to changes in society and knowledge and make it available to organizations both large and small? The first step is getting an understanding of what we mean by documentation. And during 2024, a documentation task force met to look at and update the concept and definition of documentation. It's a processual definition which seeks to emphasize the concepts that I've been talking about. In the phrase, everything is connected. In other words, it emphasizes that museum documentation is not simply about the thing in isolation, but the knowledge relations around the collection with a responsibility for representing diversity and dynamism. The new proposed definition workshop this week at CIDOC 2024 is transdisciplinary, dynamic, and aimed at capturing new knowledge as it's discovered. New systems which natively use graphs to allow flexibility and expand and modify models naturally by the users make the definition not only practical, but much more efficient than using database systems and put us in a position of attempting to address the legacy of data we've built up. And it is beneficial to both large and small organizations, reducing the need for lots of technical layers and resources. It provides one place where subject experts, documentation professionals, and technologists can collaborate with fewer overheads and resolve the contradiction between static systems and meaningful digital communication. Using CIDOC CRM and a native internal semantic graph system, organizations can continually expand their knowledge they hold without the need for expensive pipelines and technical resources. In other words, the challenge is to have systems that meet the dynamic nature of new documentation and make it efficient and effective. As a dynamic information resource, a living resource that evolves and responds to new knowledge, interconnecting and synthesizing information directly between organizations. Going back to the problem highlighted by Sean Woodward, we have a contradiction in that people who generate new knowledge are unable to change and expand the models they work with in the collection. The mentality of this inappropriate division of labor is also based on the cost of owning database information systems. But which is only defined on the technical side. The cost of the system, the hardware, the support and maintenance. Locking the model and removing user flexibility is part of this equation, which is another reason why we need to start changing systems. The CIDOC CRM and native knowledge graph technology as the source of documentation systems, but also as an organization's knowledge base, its fuller knowledge base, doesn't use predefined fields, but creates a framework that responds to new knowledge generated as part of our normal working activities. The benefits are clear. Greater empowerment for content experts, richer content for education and research, greater scope for collaboration, participation, and greater diversity. This is already being employed in organizations as an institutional system. This is research base, which is being used in the Collection Care Department of the National Gallery, where they are encouraged to do flexible modeling of their work as they see it, as it's being done in knowledge maps, which are a different view on the database behind it, but which allow them to create knowledge in a flexible and dynamic way. So their objectives are to record any knowledge, support multiple uses, not just be a single function-based system, unite practice and theory, support the idea of a practitioner researcher producing knowledge as they work, greater participation, and change and transformation over time. So in summary, combining knowledge graphs, CIDOC CRM, flexible authoring, interoperability, and dynamic knowledge, equals interoperability and dynamic knowledge building and diversity. And I haven't got my last slide on this, so I can't do that. But I had an interactive animation of how you dynamically and flexibly use that knowledge graph system. But I'll stop it there. Thanks very much.
All right. Hi, I'm Erin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford and co-supervised by the Victoria and Albert Museum. And today I'm going to talk about some work that I've done as part of my doctoral research and introduce an ontology for the representation of reparative critical cataloging in museums. So problematic language in museum cataloging can take various forms, such as explicit slurs, racist, sexist, or ableist language, and outdated or colonial names for peoples, places, and cultural objects. Museums today are seeking to identify best practices for addressing problematic language in their catalog data, a practice that's become known as critical cataloging, or to be more specific, reparative critical cataloging for this particular task. Identifying occurrences of problematic language is a first step in many of these reparative critical cataloging projects, but it's not easy to just begin. And this is a key point that's raised by practitioners and would-be practitioners in the field, that it can be really tricky to figure out where to start. There is little domain-wide guidance on what to look for, and different institutions will have and will care about different kinds of language. And then, of course, is the question of what to do once instances have been identified. This too has little consensus in the field, although some trends towards best practice are starting to emerge. Museums engaged in this work therefore spend significant time coming up with search lists and making suggested actions and determining criteria for when they feel a potential action would be the most appropriate. The way that museums communicate these decisions internally is through terminology guidance documents. These are documents that will identify the language that the institution is interested in looking for, paired with instructions on what catalogers should do as reparative or remediative actions when they encounter that term. And I think it's important to note that these aren't as simple as glossaries of quote-unquote bad words. Terms are words that institutions might find problematic in themselves, or may be problematic given context of use, or that may point to broader issues in a catalog record. And it's these documents that I've been working with in my research, which is situated in part at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So the approaches that the V&A Museum takes to dealing with problematic terminology in their catalog data are documented in the V&A Terminology Guidance document. This document contains sort of three main sections. So one, potentially problematic terms and their forms. Two, term descriptions, so a number of different ways that the term has been understood or used across times and places. And three, a list of suggestions that could be considered based on specifics of the term encounter, such as who or what is being described, the original intended use of the term in the record, and the field in the record where the term is found. Particularly whether or not the institution feels that this is a field that they can make a direct edit to, or something that they want to preserve and therefore may need other strategies around. There's also, of course, information about the document itself to consider. Both the document as a whole and individual entries are written, edited, and informed by the expertise of various people over time, all of which is important to represent when we're looking to represent this domain. As the focus of this project was on defining an ontology for the representation of reparative critical cataloging in museums, I just want to point to some of the most relevant bodies of work that also exist in the field. So in this one, I'm looking at the domain of ontology development for cultural heritage data, linguistics, and problematic terminology. Following a review of these fields, I felt that CIDOC CRM, Ontolex, SCOS, and Calco are the most relevant for this project. I'm not going to go into any of these in detail in the time of this presentation, but if you're curious, please look them up. Ultimately, I found that each of these ontologies contributed to an aspect of the domain, but that none were sufficient in themselves or even really in combination to fully represent the distinctive components of terminology guideline documents and reparative critical cataloging work. While they cover many of the peripheral elements, they lack coverage of concepts that are core and or unique to this new area of practice. However, the set of ontologies does provide a robust foundation to build from, which is how I have proceeded. So since there isn't time in a 10-minute presentation to go through details of ontology, I'm just going to point you to a link to a draft documentation and talk at a very high level now. Of course, I'd welcome any feedback and comments if anybody is interested in looking at the ontology and wanting to talk to me afterwards, so please do. So what you can see here on this slide is a diagram of the project ontology, knowing it will not be readable in detail on any single slide. But I hope from sort of the visual layout of this, you can take away three main things. First, that not unlike the terminology guideline documents themselves, there's sort of like three big sections to representing this work. First is this notion of sort of a terminology section, which is in the top left, which details elements for covering the structure and contents of these documents, such as terms, definitions and senses, and then metadata about the documents themselves. The guideline section on the bottom left then covers suggestions made about those terms, the relationships between suggestions and context, so both details in relation to the field and the record. And then the workflow section on the right-hand side will cover the use of these documents, so steps around identifying terms and selecting and implementing reparative actions. So the second point from this is I hope for the color coding to give an idea of how much from each existing ontology I'm pulling from or where those bases can really come into play. As you can see, CIDOC CRM, which is the one that is in orange, is highly represented, especially in the workflow section, which is all about actions and events. Lastly, I hope that this shows that what I found missing really was those core elements necessary to describe this domain and to bring these other ontologies together to sort of build these bridges across the data domains and their academic communities. Most of the project classes and properties are really at the center of the diagram because they define things like the guides, terms, senses, suggestions, and points of encounter that are necessary for representing critical cataloging guidelines and documented practices. So at this point, I'm about halfway through my PhD. Knowledge graph structured according to this ontology has been populated with the contents of a few different terminology guideline documents. The schema and contents have been reviewed by stakeholders, and competency questions have been generated and used to validate the ontology and knowledge graph. And for next steps, I'm now looking at exploring knowledge graph embedding models to leverage this graph structure to see if these sorts of methods can be used to surface records that may be more likely sites of encounter with problematic terminology. But I'd like to spend sort of my last couple of minutes talking about what I hope to do with this work. On an immediate sort of practical level, I hope to continue to build on it to develop an ontology-based system for supporting, not replacing, decision-making in reparative critical cataloging. I hope that this work, in particular the development of this ontology and related knowledge graph, can help address practical issues in critical cataloging related to the need to develop domain-wide guidance about what to look for and possible remediative actions by making it possible to share across institutions what is being looked for, how it is being defined, understood, and identified, and what is being recommended when instances are encountered. In doing this, I hope to create a framework that brings together different communities of academics, such as linguists, museologists, and historians, as well as different communities of practitioners working at different institutions through shared data infrastructure. But what I really hope to accomplish with this is to show how critical theory, in particular queer and feminist theory, can inform how and what we build in the technology space. I'm hoping to reflect values and concerns from these bodies of theory in ways that you can see through both the structure and the data that is populated within it. And in doing so, I'm really interested in hoping to build tools that foreground critical thinking, and in doing so, unsettle status quo and bring to light fractures in existing ways of working and the data infrastructures that support those practices. And I want to end on this note because I think that there are a lot of assumptions that can be made when we use the word critical. And I hope to clarify that when I'm talking about building critically, or as Julia Flanders might say, to talk about building otherwise, which is what I hope to do here, this is how I mean it. An approach to technology that starts with theory-informed ideals and values and goes out from there. This work doesn't sit in a silo. It's one potential piece of wider movements inside and outside of museums, of which critical cataloging is only a small part. So if you are also doing this kind of work, I hope that what I've introduced here may have the potential to support your efforts as well as all of your work has inspired mine. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So, We've been talking about sustaining connections and building knowledge networks, but I want to draw your attention to the areas of disconnects. I will be talking about this in the context of my PhD research, which looks at the history and practice of collections documentation in English museums and its impact on the digital cultural record. So I want to think about how people, collections, and technology interact in museums, acknowledging that this relationship is messy and lopsided. The impetus of my project has been a disconnect between the theory and practice of collections documentation. So my work is asking which people and which collections have been missing from our sector conversations, and what does a focus on technology exclude? So museum studies has focused on documentation in terms of a history of its recording technologies, from the daybook to index cards to computerized databases, relational databases, internet connectivity, Web 2.0 and onwards. And there was a flurry of publications around early computerization systems in the 60s, 70s and 80s, which were published by people who developed the computer systems and by the people who developed the data standards required to make the collections information machine readable. So the literature review that I've done would suggest that standardization has brought order to the chaos of idiosyncratic museum documentation. But what the literature's focus on technology and standards has occluded is how widely and how effectively these have been adopted in practice. The voices of technologists and of policymakers are well represented, but less so the people who are responsible for the work of documenting collections. In digital humanities, the focus has not been on histories, but on possibilities, on the catalogue as corpus and museum collections as big data, focusing on what is technically possible on the data that we in museums have accumulated. And this is evidenced in various projects in a UK context, in the Towards a National Collection project, the Museum Data Service, and many others working with linked open data on the idea of digital repatriation and on the use of AI. But such projects can fail to interrogate the processes by which this collection's data has been created. This is something that has been highlighted by feminist, anti-racist, and post-colonial scholars who interrogate the biases inherent in the digital cultural record. So neither museum studies nor digital humanities scholarship has addressed the fact that there are large proportions of our physical collections in UK museums which remain undocumented and undigitized. And here lies the disconnect. So my experience, before my PhD, working in museums for 15 years, has been of a lack of documentation, missing data, missing locations, missing provenance, and objects that have become disconnected from their meanings. So as a practitioner, I am left wondering, if we have the tools and we have the standards, why are there still so many unknown unknowns? Many collections professionals will know this feeling, but it is not evident in the literature. There are many reasons for this, including the invisible nature of documentation work, which is categorized as back office work and often seen as boring compared to more creative curatorial work. In museums' reluctance to admit that their records are not as good as they would like them to be, and in their desire to focus on the potential of technological innovation rather than getting bogged down with the backlog. But ignoring the issue of documentation has allowed the gaps between theory and practice, between policy and action, and between the people-facing work and collections-facing work of museums to become wider. So I had a strong feeling that it wasn't just me, and what I've done to address the fact that museum documentation practitioners have not had a voice in sector and academic discourse is to understand the practice of collections on the ground, privileging the voice of the practitioner. I've done this with a survey of people who work with collections information in museums which are accredited under the Arts Council England's accreditation scheme, which is a best practice standard in the UK, and with case studies in 3 regional museums. And of course, privileging the voice of the practitioner and focusing on the people who work in those museums. So the following slides will show some of the findings from my survey, thinking about what is missing when we focus only on digital collections records. So participants were asked to gauge what proportion of the records in their collections management system included photographs, enhanced levels of digitization, such as 3D scans or searchable PDFs, and multimedia files. So as you would expect, photographs are better represented than other forms of digitization, although a large number of participants reported that only a minority of their records included photographs. And only one respondent said that all of their records had photographs. The responses for enhanced digitization and multimedia also indicate that although these enhanced technologies are often touted as better ways of expressing the meaning and physicality of an object, these are also poorly represented when you look across the collections in our systems. The final question sought to look at the quality and usefulness of cataloguing of the records. Participants were asked what proportion of their records they considered to be of an enhanced standard, which I defined as a record that contains all the core inventory information, as well as thorough cataloguing information, for example, detailed descriptions explaining the context and significance of the object and linking it to relevant people, exhibitions, and event records. So again, only one person responded that all of their collections were of this standard. 6% reported that none of their records were of this standard, and around half of the participants thought that only a minority were. And this is not to say that the knowledge, research, and interpretation of the collections does not exist, but it has just not made it into the CMS. So another question asked what other systems people were using to manage their records day to day. So no one said they didn't use any other records. The most popular was accession registers, which isn't surprising. Spreadsheets were also very popular, and comments suggested that these are used as a workaround when people can't access or can't edit the database on the go. And this obviously leads to duplication and an increased risk of error. And the fact that people are still using and referring to index cards and paper history files indicates that these have not been scanned and added to the database. So, very quick headlines from my research case studies. Technologies, and particularly data migration, remain an issue. 2 of my case studies had invested in new database systems but not been able to migrate all their records to them, and were still having to use both systems to manage their collections. Collections disciplines and specialisms still matter. And this is most obvious in natural history collections, which are often shared through large-scale aggregators for the scientific research community. And this could be seen as a great use case for collections. It has an obvious impact outside the museum, but it's not suitable for every type of collection. And for some collections, such as ethnographic material, this would be particularly problematic. And finally, my interviews have shown the importance of personal connections. Interviewees said that while their colleagues across the museum could access the database themselves, they preferred to go through their colleagues. This is because this is not necessarily about gatekeeping, but that the curators had intangible knowledge of the collections that couldn't be stored in the systems. They also had better knowledge of the systems themselves, and they had skills to make connections that other people could not see. So I've talked about the connections between people, collections, and technologies, but really the connections are between people and collections and people and technologies. Digitized collections do not happen without the labor of collections professionals. This labor enables people outside the museum to use collections information, but only that is made visible by the work of the documentation person. There are other people outside the museum who are digitally excluded, and they're also excluded when the information documented does not meet their needs or their cultural perspectives. Meanwhile, inside the museum, engagements with the objects continue offline, but a lot of this engagement and information will not make its way into the database. It may be recorded in project files and documentation, but again, this will pile up along with the other historic documentation that isn't accessible through the database, so it can become invisible. And again, when we focus on digital collections, we are ignoring the vast amounts of material which remains undocumented outside of the digital knowledge network. So, privileging the voice of the people who work with collections highlights the fact, which Saskia mentioned in her opening of the conference, that we are human, we're not cogs in a machine, we're not perfect operators of technology or followers of guidelines. We, as workers, get distracted, we struggle with being pulled in multiple directions in our under-resourced work, and we focus on the things that make a difference to people, our colleagues and our audiences, although we know that in doing so, our documentation backlogs grow. So I'm ending on a plea, really, to pay attention to those colleagues and audiences and those collections who've been left outside of the conversation and outside of the loop, and to think about how we can work to better integrate these disconnected worlds. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. First, I would like to thank you the opportunity to be here and to present what has been the project of my short academic life. My name is Cláudia Furtado. I'm a PhD student in art history in the specialization of museology and artistic heritage. And today I will outline the stages involved in the development of the procedurals manual for the collection of musical instruments of the Museu Nacional da Música, National Music Museum in Lisbon, Portugal, highlighting the challenges and the opportunities encountered through this journey, which is still ongoing. So, these are the keywords. How did it all begin? The idea of developing a procedures manual didn't happen overnight. In fact, it all began in 2019 during the Musa Partnership project internship. At that time, the goal was to analyze the catalogs, records of the musical instrument collection published on the online platform MatrizNet and verify if the information was presented in a language accessible to a wide range of audiences and which information fields were filled in. Throughout this analysis, I realized the records showed a great disparity, both in treatment of information and in its presentation. Some records were more complete than others, and the vocabulary used was not always the same, and in some cases the texts the informations were not entirely understandable to those without musical knowledge like me. The following year, as part of my master's in museology, I had the opportunity to delve deeper into this analysis, aiming to understand the reasons behind this disparity. After an exhaustive diagnosis of the collection's methods, it became evident that the differences in the various records were due to the fact that they had been registered by different people at different times. Essentially, what was lacking was consistency and coherency in the documentation procedures. In this sense, my master's proposal was to provide some contributions to the construction of a user guide, a kind of procedure manual that could assist the members of the museum's team in the tasks of documenting the collection. Since 2021, following my master's thesis defense and now as a doctoral project, the main goal shifts to the actual construction of the manual itself, considering not only the documentation procedures intrinsic to the good collection management, but also those related to the recording of the performative use of musical instruments played at museum events. To develop the framework of the manual, I initially formulated 3 questions. First was, what is the manual purpose? Who would use it? And last but not least, how would they use it? Thinking about the answers to these questions helped me figure it out. This document aims to record a set of standards and practical guidelines for documentation of musical instruments collection. The use of this manual is specifically intended for any museum collaborators who carry out documentation tasks related to the collection under the responsibility of the museum, and the main goal of the manual is to be a working document, so it should be consulted case by case according to the task to be performed. Through these answers, it was also possible to reflect and think about the vocabulary and terminologies to be used, the most functional format, and also the structure and the organization of its contents. At this point, you might be wondering if there aren't already similar projects or even manuals that could be adapted to the museum's collection. And the truth is, before moving forward with the creation of a manual, an exhaustive survey of Portuguese and international reference standards was conducted. These are some of the examples of guidelines for museum documentation that serve as the basis for this project, but specifically in the Portuguese context, with the exception of these cataloging standards for musical instruments published in 2011, there is no other procedure manual focused on collections of musical instruments. However, this one do not take into account certain aspects related to the documentation of a musical instrument. For example, the issue of documenting performative use is not addressed here, not even the relevance of different fields of information. Also, these standards were focusing on cataloging and do not contemplate other documentation procedures. And in addition to all of these standards were developed for a specific software, Matriz, which makes it difficult for other users with different databases to adopt them. And this has been one of the biggest challenges, to make sure that the procedures were independent of a collection management software so that any interested institution can use this manual. At the same time, considering that the museum continues to use Matriz, it is necessary that the procedures defined are compatible with this software. To make this easier, I'm working on some matching terms. As you can see here, the idea is for users to be able to find and fill the information in Matriz. Another need identified in the diagnosis, and that has proven to be a great challenge, is the compatibility of the pre-existing procedures in the museum and the theory of good practices. The idea was always not to neglect the work done at the museum over the years, seeking rather a balance between what the theory tells us and what makes sense in the concrete daily life of the museum. Over the past 4 years, I've been working with the direct contribution with the museum to ensure that the procedures described in the manual are compatible with the practice and vice versa. Finally, the complexity of intersecting disciplinary fields like music and archival science, and this has required a constant contact with researchers in these fields, mostly musicologists. As a complement to the manual, I've been working on a glossary that will serve as a support for the cataloging and documentation records, but in this phase, it's just for the museological part. In fact, for example, I'm translating to Portuguese some of the terms defined at the Dictionary of Museology published last year by ICOM. To finish my presentation, let me know that since the initial draft of 2021, the manual has undergone several interactions tested by interns, volunteers, and museum staff. Based on their feedback, I've made some adjustments to ensure the procedures are user-friendly and effective, and the manual is expected to reach the final version in the middle of next year, 2025. Following my PhD defense, the general guidelines and the entire construction process will be published. Thank you for your attention.
Good almost afternoon. I'm Diane Zorich, Director of the Digitization Program Office at the Smithsonian, and I wanted to share with you today how we are using various tools to track and measure our digitization efforts. But first, I wanted to give you some context of, oops, these are not my slides.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for your understanding. And thank you to the folks in the box for making the correction so quickly. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of an update about the Smithsonian. People think of us as one big entity, but in fact, we have many component parts. We have 21 museums, most of which are clustered on or around the U.S. National Mall in Washington, D.C. But we also have 8 research centers, which are scattered further afield, from our Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to the Smithsonian Tropical Research Center, which is in Panama. Excuse me. Collectively, we have 157 million objects and specimens, including living collections. We have a zoo, we have extensive botanical gardens and nurseries. Although we're mostly based in Washington, D.C., we truly have a global footprint. Our researchers, curators, and scientists are conducting projects in over 100 countries. So our size and our organizational diversity makes us a nexus for research and education, but it comes with enormous challenges, particularly around digitization. From a collections point of view, we have what we call our scale challenge. We have objects in multiples, like these natural history collections, where it's not unusual to have 4 million botanical specimen sheets, or, get this, 42 million paleobiological fossil specimens. But we also have what we would characterize as unique, one-of-a-kind history, art, and culture objects. So the diversity and the size of our collections are both a strength and they're a challenge, as very few of our holdings are on display. In fact, we estimate less than 1% is on display at any time. So my office, the Digitization Program Office, which we fondly refer to as DPO, was created in 2009 to address the challenge of scale in digitization. And we want to enable discovery through digitization by creating the digital assets, or the building blocks, if you will, for digital experiences. And we work to achieve this by measuring what's been digitized across the institution, by increasing the number and quality of digital assets, by amplifying the impact of those assets, and by relentlessly pursuing methodologies and technologies from any sector that will help us further our work and push the cultural heritage digitization envelope further. And we work across the institution to do this through 3 programs. Our Policy and Analysis program is responsible for assessing the amount and the state of digitization among our libraries, archives, and museums on a yearly basis. Our Collections Digitization program focuses on creating 2D digital images and digital records, and it has 3 teams that achieve this effort. The Mass Digitization team, who works on leveraging the economies of scale that come with digitizing large museum collections. They essentially employ industrial-like production efforts and technologies to help us catch up with our backlog of undigitized materials. Then we have the Imaging Services team. They provide digital imaging support for the annual accessions, which we call our keep-up digitization, and also for the small-scale digitization projects that are not amenable to mass digitization. And then we have our informatics team, which works on enriching and creating digital records using automated, scalable, and reusable solutions. Finally, we have our 3D digitization program, which uses 3-dimensional scanning technology, analysis tools, and a distribution platform to create 3D models that support storytelling, preservation, documentation, and research. So I'm going to talk about one tool for each of those programs. Our Policy and Analysis program, we use an in-house tool that we fondly call CIDOC, which is an acronym for the Collections and Digitization Reporting System. Every year, every one of the Smithsonian's libraries, archives, and museums is responsible for reporting on the state of digitization of their collections using this system. In particular, they have to record how they group their collections, the percentage of items within those groupings that have a standard digital image and a standard digital record, and the percentage of items in those groupings that they've prioritized for future digitization. Once this information is entered by all the libraries, archives, and museums, our policy and analysis program team generates individual and aggregate reports on the progress we're making, and this information can be found on the public Smithsonian dashboard. If you just Google Smithsonian dashboard, you'll find it, and just search on the collections page and drill down. This is a snapshot of the collections digitization page on the dashboard. It shows you the aggregate totals on the top left, but it also gives the user the ability to drill down deeper. If you go into the table on the right, that's an interactive table. You can search on a particular museum to see what their digitization status is. You can search on all the museums, all the libraries, all the archives in an aggregated manner. Now, behind the scenes, we compare these numbers year by year, and we report on our progress to the Smithsonian Senior Administration, but also to the United States government's Office of Management and Budget. Moving on to our collections digitization program, we've created a digitization dashboard and utility, which we call Osprey. It automates, it visualizes, and it monitors progress on all our projects, from digital capture through all the file checks that digital file has to go through before it's ingested into our digital asset management system, or DAMS. So we use Osprey for workflow tracking, for statistics on our projects, and for image quality inspection reviews. All of our projects in our collections digitization program are tracked with this tool. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can click on any one of those tabs and see all the mass digitization projects, all the informatics projects, or all the imaging services projects. Now, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to show you a brief video of how this tool is currently being used to track a mass digitization project underway that we're working with the Getty on for the Johnson Publishing Archive. It's a collection of historically important images documenting the African American experience in the United States over the past 7 decades. This archive, which we refer to as JPC archive, is comprised of over 3 million photographic prints and negatives, as well as videos from the Johnson Publishing Company, which was an African American owned media company, best known for publishing the magazines Ebony and Jet. This is an amazing collection saved from dispersal at auction by the foresight of 4 foundations who purchased it en masse and then donated it jointly to the Getty and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Now, when you click on the top here, the JPC archive, from the dashboard homepage, you're going to be taken to a project details page, which gives you general information about the project, such as the total number of images taken, the total number of items digitized, etc. So I'll think, yes, good, it's working. If you click on the project statistics bar, you can do an even deeper dive into the production statistics of the project. How much of this project's phase is finished, the average number of items digitized per day, the average number of days it takes to go from when the item is digitized to coming to DPO, and then from DPO to go to the archivist for quality control, and then to come back to DPO, and then when it's all said and done, it goes through various checks and it can be sent to the DAMS. And we also have some visualizations which show, in this case, this one shows you the number of images digitized per day. On the middle here, if you go back, you'll see these green tabs, which are folders of images that are awaiting processing. And if you click on the folders, you see all the image files, and you see all the file checks that the file has to go through before it can be ingested into the DAMS. Green, of course, means they passed. I would never show you a page that had red. But you can also click on the files, and you get to the image, and you scroll down, and you can see the embedded metadata as well. So this is Osprey. We use it for all our projects. Again, it's an internal tool. We do have a public version of it, but it doesn't have the images because of rights issues. But we try to be transparent about our processes to the extent we can. Okay, moving on to 3D digitization. For the 3D digitization program, the important metric we want to gather is around the usage of our 3D models. So we're currently experimenting with Splunk and Google Analytics 4 to gain some insights. So the examples I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes have to do with the iconic object you see here, which is the 1903 Wright Flyer, the first heavier-than-air flying machine, which successfully flew for 59 seconds in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17, 1903. The original now resides in the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian. But we have digitized, 3D digitized this object, and you can see it here on the Smithsonian's 3D website, embedded in an open source viewer we have created called Voyager. Now, the Wright Flyer 3D model is part of our open access collection, which means anybody can download it and use it for any reason whatsoever without asking us permission. So the question for us is, given how we've set it into the wild, how do we monitor the use of this object out there? And I mentioned we're using Splunk. Splunk, at its core, is a software program that just parses log files. You can use it to search, monitor, and analyze any machine-generated data. And in fact, at the Smithsonian, we use Splunk mostly for monitoring our back-of-the-house infrastructure systems. But the 3D team is using it to log requests to our Voyager viewer. And our Voyager viewer can be embedded on any web property. So what Splunk does, it goes out on the web and looks for embedded models in the Voyager viewer. And it gathers 2 data points, views and downloads. We're also using Google Analytics 4, which looks at, if you know 3D website web pages, it digs deeper for information on the web page. So we want to know on our 3D website, how many people are engaging with the article content, how many people are using the augmented reality viewer capabilities, et cetera. So whereas Splunk has a broader range over the internet, it has a smaller number of data points it collects, just 2, the views and the downloads. Google Analytics 4 has a smaller range in that it focuses right on the web page, but it has many more data points it can capture. So we find that using these 2 tools in a somewhat complementary fashion can uncover for us some of the oddities we see in the data. And I'll show you an example in this graph. I know it's really hard to see, so I'll try to translate it for you. But the top graph are data views of the Wright Flyer captured by Splunk from, I believe, 2021. And you see that it's pretty consistent till September of 2023, when suddenly there's a bump, and it goes pretty high. Sometimes it even goes over 10,000 views per month. So the question we had was, what's causing that? What happened in September of 2023 to show this bump? So we start looking with Google Analytics on the various web pages around the Smithsonian, and we saw that the National Air and Space Museum, which has a web page for the Wright Flyer, did not embed the viewer in the 3D model until September of 2023. So we suspect that that's responsible for most of the bump. But I do want to emphasize that we have to be careful in how we surmise, and what we surmise causes these kinds of things. And I want to give you an example of that. We like doing top 10 lists. What are our top 10 downloads for September and our top 10 views in September? But really, when we look at these lists, what do they say? What do they tell us? They tell us the most frequently viewed things and the most frequently downloaded things. But we can speculate only on why that is, and I'll relate an anecdote here. If you look at the downloads chart on the right, the objects that have arrows in front of them are species of corals that we 3D captured. And that was really surprising to us. We have a lot of iconic 3D objects. Why are all these corals being downloaded? We do have a number of research projects on coral bleaching around the world as an indicator of ocean health and climate change. We also have some digital initiatives around corals. We speculated perhaps people are getting engaged with these, and they're doing a deeper dive, I'm sorry for that pun, on looking at individual corals and downloading them. But then we had a sobering conversation with the invertebrate zoology curators and collections managers at the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian, which is where this collection is physically housed, who thought there was a more prosaic reason. They believe that word has gotten around in the aquarium trade that the Smithsonian has free, high-quality 3D models of corals and they're being downloaded and printed and used in the Korea. That is totally fine. That is what the open access collection is for. You use it for what you want to use it. But my point here is that, you know, in a nutshell, this is the conundrum we face. We have this information, right, we gather, but annoyingly, we have very little knowledge about what it means. So I'm going to just close with one final comment. This is a quote by Einstein. It's just a partial quote. The whole quote is, "Not everything that is counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." And that last part of the quote really resonates with me, because what is it that counts that cannot be counted? And for us, that's anecdotal data, how our collections are being used. Sometimes we just stumble upon how users are using our collections. Sometimes users tell us they're very proud of a use they've made, so they actually contact us and tell us. And over the years, what we've stumbled upon or have been told about are really creative, interesting uses. And these are just some of them. There's all the way to the left, lower left, somebody took a bronze from our Asian Art Museum and reconfigured it as a Easter chocolate online. Somebody did an augmented reality projection of the Apollo 11 command module all the way on the right and had their child positioned under it as if he's holding it all by himself in midair. These are fun and whimsical things, but there's also really serious research going on. You'll see in the top, in the middle left, there's a 3D model of a triceratops, and there was a paleontology graduate student who's studying form and function in dinosaurs, and so he took that model and overlaid it with articulation of musculature to try to determine how this animal might have moved if the musculature was positioned in different ways, which is really important kind of research information. You also see in the middle and the top right some really interesting creative works of art. In the middle is a sculpture which is actually 3D printed. It's a very small, delicate, fragile sculpture. You can hold it in the palm of your hand, so the image is a little deceiving in scale. But it was inspired by, it was done by an artist in New York who told us it was inspired by the vertebra of a stegosaurus. Okay. And then you see in the upper top an almost surrealistic view of digital painting that incorporated our corals. Now, all of these accounts, these anecdotal accounts, give us insights into how our collections are fueling creativity and how people are using them in ways to enrich their lives. And they form a sort of overstory to all of the data capture efforts we're trying to do that can't be easily counted, but very much counts. And in the end, having people use our collections for ways that are meaningful for them forms the true measure of our success. So thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Agata Franaszek. I'm an art historian and a historian, currently working in the Collections Management Department of the National Museum in Krakow. To start with, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present my speech to you. My presentation is inspired by the conference theme related to building connections as well as creating and developing social knowledge networks by making museum collections more available. The presentation discusses the topic of sharing collections and reusing photographs of museum objects in collaboration with a contemporary artist to create connections in society as exemplified by the Salty Bread and Welcome projects. The Salty Bread project took place in 2016 at the Krakow Saltworks Museum in Wieliczka in cooperation with a contemporary artist, Natalia Wiernik, head of the photography department at the Academy of Fine Art in Krakow, the winner of the Sony World Photography Award, and the project was carried out as a part of the anniversary celebration of the opening of the permanent exhibition in the Wieliczka salt mine, which had been inscribed on the first UNESCO World Heritage List in 1978. The contemporary project focused on the artist's work with the collection and museum space, the potential of which was an inspiration for creating site-specific works. Natalia Wiernik, using photography, video, and performative activities, raised in her project issues related to the uniqueness of the place, that is the Mine Museum, its role in protecting the centuries-old mining heritage, and a reflection on the museum exhibit. The artist decided to combine photographs of salt cellars from the Wieliczka Museum collection with high-resolution reproductions of some 17th century Dutch still lifes obtained from the digitized resources of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, shared in Rijksstudio. Here are some examples of that. Using photographs of digitized objects processed in Photoshop, she created large-format artistic photographs printed in the lightbox technique and videos. The artist introduced her own order into the collection of museum salt cellars, usually strictly ordered and categorized. The chaos and accumulation of elements thrown off the table by the artist revealed the enormity of the collection and encouraged a new look at the museum exhibits. The salt cellars placed against the background of reproductions of still lifes symbolically becoming elements of tableware and everyday objects again. Disorder, light reflected off the shiny surfaces, and the use of richly decorated luxurious objects are the common denominator connecting the work of old masters with contemporary creation. Light boxes and videos were installed in the underground museum exhibition in the mine. In addition to photographs of objects, the artist also created video and performance that was intended to draw attention to the work of contemporary museum employees who take care of both the mine space itself and the collection. This multi-dimensional project based on the museum's collection combined and met the needs of various groups of recipients: museum employees, the local community, and residents of nearby Krakow, especially interested in contemporary art. The Salty Bread project is important in the context of broadly understood collection sharing. For the first time, the museum has made both the exhibition and the collection so widely available for the purpose of artistic activities. Thanks to the artist's work, many of the objects that did not fit in the permanent exhibition were shown in photographs. Sharing collections, which allows to download high-resolution photographs of museums' exhibit, created a unique and unrepeatable opportunity for the artist to create a completely new, original work of art, which in the absence of such access would not have been created. The second project, called Welcome, took place in 2022 and included an exhibition, conference, and a photo book in which Natalia Wiernik used photographs of historic chasubles and liturgical fabrics made of textiles imported from the Middle East, from the collection of the National Museum in Krakow, showing the multicultural nature of the Polish heritage. The project brought together sociologists, writers, art historians, and artists from different countries in a dialogue that focused on phenomena related to the issue of migration, such as fear of the unknown and exclusion. Its creation was influenced by the situation of refugees in the world and the radical change in the situation in Europe and the world related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In her individual project, which was included in the photo book, the artist used photographs of digitized historic chasubles and liturgical fabrics from the National Museum collection shared in digital collections on the website, to symbolically show the possibility of coexistence of various cultures and beliefs, which can complement each other and not compete. In addition to the photo book, the photographs were presented at an exhibition entitled Restless Souls, Artists from the Krakow Academy of Fine Arts. Each artist had the task of reflection on their previous work and was given one room in the building of the former theological seminary for their own presentation. In her presentation, Natalia Wiernik decided to focus on fabric, which is the leitmotif of her photographic work. She also decided to refer to current events related to the war in Ukraine. In the room intended for her, she placed photographs of liturgical vestments from the collection of the National Museum in Krakow and a photo of a handmade blanket that one of the Ukrainian families fleeing from the town of Bucha in Ukraine took with them as one of the most important mementos reminding them of home. The floor was covered with fabrics that the artist uses for photo session and black plastic bags, referring to the thousands of Ukrainian victims. This type of an artistic project shows that digitized photograph of museum objects can be used as comments on current events. To sum up, it can be said that thanks to the digitalization and making collections widely available through cooperation with contemporary artists, museums become generators of cultural development, introducing new context and meaning into circulation, which can encourage reflection and different attitude to the objects they collect, and thus define the identity of the recipients through confrontations with the exhibited object. It's the way to expand knowledge about the object and expand the networks of cooperation between the museum and various groups of recipients. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists. If I can invite you up for questions. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Any questions from the audience?
Just a photo shoot then.
That's right. Yes, David, right up front.
I have a question for Erin. I'm really interested in the ontology that you've been developing, and I'm wondering, for what community do you think it will be most useful, the work you're doing directly, as opposed to sort of indirectly through the work of documentation?
Hopefully this is most directly useful for catalogers who are engaging in the work of reparative cataloging. The way that I hope it to be useful for this particular set of folks is in two ways. One is in providing this as a resource for people who are seeking to begin the practice or are struggling with those questions of I don't know where to begin, or I know this is important, how do I convince my organization to be on board in this? How can I use this to make it not me against you, like us within an organization, but us as an organization working towards new and emerging best practice, as is evidenced by all these other institutions that are working towards these shared goals, and the way that sort of collective guidance can be used for navigating those internal conversations. A second way that I do hope it to be useful to that community as well is where I'd like to build on this work and what I'm sort of focusing on in the next year, which is building, at least prototyping, a tool that you could bring a subset of your collections data to and leverage the knowledge contained within the knowledge in the knowledge graph to help see within your records which ones may be more likely to be sites of potential encounter with problematic terminology, or where you might be able to begin to see okay, in this record, this language is used in a way that I am uncomfortable with. Here are some ways that this is being thought about or addressed by the museum sector more generally. Of these, are there methods that might be suited to my particular context, and be able to actively engage in the work that way as well. Thank you. Thanks.
Other questions? Over here on the,
Hi, Chris Dijkshoorn in the Rijksmuseum. I think, so thank you all for your presentations. I think there were really nice complementary aspects to it, and one of the overarching themes was sort of capturing the things that do not fit in our sort of regular procedures or regular systems. So this might be a question asked to Dominic mainly. You're pleading for a sort of more free-form expression of the knowledge that we have within our organizations, and moving away from the more tabular structures and database structures. Research space is one of those systems that could capture that, but do you see a sort of complementary form of still having those more structured sources in combination with the more free-form knowledge that we're also capturing.
So if you mean structured in terms of the traditional sort of museum database, I think it's hard to predict what's actually going to happen, but I would say the days should be numbered and that we should be transferring over to these new types of systems, simply because the way in which we actually work as organizations in terms of the subject content professionals, the conservators, the scientists, the conservators, etc., all work in a particular way, and they're not well supported by those systems, although every day they have to fill out the forms and do the administrative work. But they're not actually, as I showed in that social media clip, that they're actually not able to record the knowledge they're generating as they're actually working. But this is an issue that's been going on for a long time. I mean, when I started ResearchBase, the issues that I brought up in that presentation are all the issues that the Mellon brought up with the museums 13 years ago. Yeah, and they were worried about silos. They were worried about the quality of information that was being used. They were worried about the fact that they were spending all this money on digitization, but actually it wasn't being used properly. So I sort of think it's overdue, and I think the technology at that time was not as developed as it was now, and there are more people who have specialisms or have knowledge and skills in this area, and I think it's about time we reviewed how we're doing core institutional systems.
And maybe a follow-up question to that, because I agree, and it would be really nice to have that sort of richer knowledge system and richer knowledge cloud. But what we also encountered working with this, that the people that build interfaces on top of this sometimes really have trouble then working with this more freer form of information. So even our very rigid linked art structures, were a bit way too free form to make a nice interface on top of. Do you foresee something happening in that area as well, where we have easier presentation layers of more fluid data?
I think I was talking to Steve Stead just before the presentation. He was saying this is exactly how people work nowadays. They don't work with all this structured tons of data and whatever. They work with stories and connections, and they work out, and there's serendipity of that process. And this is how research works as well. And we got to acknowledge that the people who are working in our museums are researchers while they're working, and they're producing stuff as they go along, and they need to be able to have a format that reflects the way they're thinking and they are working. And I don't believe that databases do that.
Could I just come in on
that,
please? Yeah. I think there's two things. One is that the tools that we have are not perfect, and I'll come to that. But often the problem is not the tools, it's the resources, it's the time, and it's the prioritization within organizations to record that information with the tools that we have. Secondly, where the issues are with the tools, I take into account all of the wider issues about kind of ontologies and privileging of different information. But I think one of the biggest problems is on the user friendliness of those systems for workers, and then by extension for users. These database interfaces that we're using in museums haven't really changed since the 90s. They're not intuitive, they're not user-friendly. And so it makes every stage of work difficult. And if, as I mentioned in my presentation, if people are resorting to using spreadsheets to actually catalogue their information rather than using this software that's meant to have been designed for that purpose, then we have a problem.
Yeah, just to say that the other point about that presentation was about interoperability and the ability for people to participate in that process, to get rid of the layers of technology, and allow people, because we're never going to solve this problem internally in our organizations. We need help from other people, we need participation, and we need to open it up a bit.
Hello, thank you for your nice talks. I'm Harry King from the National Galleries of Scotland, and I really enjoyed the talks, especially about kind of the issues we have, the gaps, and the processing of all the items. I wondered if you could explain, how do you deal with new acquisitions or new arrivals? Do they go to the back of the queue, or do they push things back further down the backlog? And who makes the decision? Or do they just arrive perfectly?
I think it depends very much on the institution. I have had experience of being the person for documenting a contemporary collecting project, and the museum I was working for then did make the decision to put some resource into that and make sure that we were capturing all of that information. For me, it was the first time that I actually had so much new information, context from the people who'd made or used the objects, context around why they were collected. It was all collected with a panel of different community members. And I'd never seen so much information about an object. But even that is not always the case. I've also worked in another institution where I've seen that after such a contemporary collecting project, the object still had quite basic records, and maybe that information was, again, there somewhere in some project files, but it wasn't in the CMS. So I think it's very dependent on the institution. I think sometimes high-profile new acquisitions maybe do go to the front of the queue, but it's very dependent on the context.
I think we have time for one more question right here up front.
I'll pose the question, and if there's no time, maybe we can answer on the coffee, we'll see. Thank you for the very interesting presentations, all of them. What struck me is that indeed, like the last presentation on the artists reusing collections, and all the different presentations focus on ways in which there are, Diane, your examples as well on reuse in how, because collections can be repositioned somewhere for other context, where there's also other knowledge and where there might be also information interesting for the museum. So my question to all of you will be, if you consider, in CIDOC we're working on the concept of inclusive documentation, and we're exploring to what extent having this open window perhaps on an open platform, like a database system online, where people could share their perception or their perspectives on how, what this collection means to them or how they will use it, if you think that will be enriching to the collection documentation.
We had a situation like that where somebody took one of our models and made a toy out of it and told us about it. It was a Japanese man, and he wrote a manga on how he did it. We put it on our website, and it was a huge hit. People really wanted to know how they could download the woolly mammoth model and make a toy out of it. And we would just say, look at this manga. And so I do think that's an example of where people do want to know and share knowledge about the uses they've made of things.
And often they have more knowledge than we do.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Some practical things. Wasn't that great? It really was. I want to make also on this day a reference to the people that sponsor this whole the whole conference. So Double Digit was on the left of the foyer, and Triply who sponsors and who has a side or a table on the right of the foyer. Please talk to them. They make this possible. Okay, have a nice lunch.